It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Black Lives Matter protests erupting around the world, Britain offering millions of Hong Kong residents a path to UK citizenship if Beijing enforces new security laws, and McDonald's reopening drive-thrus across the UK and Ireland. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is James Ashford. From the Week Junior, we have editor Felicity Capon, and from Money Week, Mr. John Stepek. James, you live by yourself, but you are now allowed, of course, to do some socially distant barbecuing. Have you yet partaken?
I have partaken in some socially distant activities, which I think we've remained largely outside of the 2 metre buffer zone. So I think they're all legal, safe and proportionate.
I find that barbecue skewers actually help enforce the 2 metre distance.
That's actually a very good idea. Especially, I'm meant to be having 2 barbecues this weekend, one on Saturday, one on Sunday. So this is becoming a festival of meat for me, which is a wonderful thing.
A festival of meat. There we are. Who needs Glastonbury? Right, Felicity, you are up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are the courts about to take the sting out of paedophile hunters?
Why do you do it? What's the point?
I can guarantee that you've done this as well. You've sat there and said, this is a problem, right? Next minute you forgot about it and done nothing about it. That's kind of what I did. But I was like, there's a problem. I'm not going to sit around and let someone else deal with the problem.
Stinson Hunter talking to 60 Minutes Australia. And Felicity, for those of us who haven't encountered Mr. Hunter and his like before, what does he do and why is that activity in the news?
So Stinson Hunter, he calls himself an accidental hero, and he sort of made a name for himself in the UK because he goes after paedophiles basically by posing as a child online and then sort of snaring paedophiles and videoing them on social media, and he racks up millions of views, and he's very, very controversial. This week, a case has come before the Supreme Court which is expected to rule on whether covert activities of paedophile hunters are legal and whether they're compatible with human rights. And the case in hand centres on a 37-year-old man called Mark Sutherland, who is a convicted paedophile, and he was snared by a vigilante group. He thought he was communicating with a 13-year-old boy on a dating app, but in reality it was actually a member of a group in Scotland called Groom Resisters Scotland. And so judges this week are basically going to consider whether prosecutions based on the operations of paedophile hunters breach the right to privacy, even the privacy of those who are seeking to abuse children. And as you can imagine, it's very controversial and emotive, obviously, because cases to do with child abuse inevitably are. But I suppose one thing to bring up straight away is that kind of what complicates this, and what I find quite interesting, is that paedophile hunters, particularly in Scotland, are surprisingly effective. It's estimated that almost half of online grooming cases have come as a result of the operations of paedophile hunters there.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that statistic, John, because it's harder, isn't it, to feel sympathy for a paedophile who's claiming that his human rights were breached by being ensnared in this way. But the point that his legal team are making, that half of online grooming cases in Scotland originate from vigilante groups, and that just simply can't be right. It's also difficult to suggest that conventional policing is doing its job, if that's the case.
Well, this is the problem, and to be honest, I feel that kind of cuts to the heart of this question. On the one hand, vigilantism in general is something we disapprove of, because we don't want citizens having to take justice into their own hands, because then you risk more miscarriages of justice. That's basically the argument against vigilantism. But the issue here is that, this, as the article says, like, huge numbers of these cases have been prosecuted based on information from these groups. So essentially the question there is, well, what are the police or the law enforcement authorities not doing that means that these vigilante groups are necessary? I mean, that is the kind of obvious question. Before we worry about throwing these people out of court, we should be thinking, well, why are we reliant on them in the first place? And if suddenly we're going to see a drop of half in the number of cases prosecuted for this stuff, then are we not actually, is that not a greater danger than tolerating it, if you like?
And one of the things the police aren't doing, James, is setting people up And part of the reason I presume for that is they want a clean prosecution. And the problem for a clean prosecution, presumably with this kind of thing, is you would need to prove that the alleged paedophile really did think they were on the way to meet a 13-year-old, rather than some defence of, oh, I thought I was participating in an online fantasy. Because actually the child isn't real. The child is usually someone like Stinson Hunter. It's a bloke in his 30s or 40s.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It can become very murky, the investigation and the prosecution. And I think that's why it's not just the risk that vigilantism poses of there kind of being more injustice through more people going out trying to do vigilantism and then actually committing crimes themselves, which a lot of paedophile hunters do end up doing. But it's because where police might themselves be tracking somebody, they might be investigating somebody, you might then have a bungling paedophile hunter kind of trying to torture them, might spook them, scare them off and end up compromising a police investigation, which is obviously done to professional standards. You know, the thing for me is looking into a number of these people who do this as an occupation, they're kind of weird. And I think the whole thing is kind of a little bit odd. If you're using your free time to go and become a paedophile hunter, I think that it certainly poses questions about kind of your own motivations, why that's such an interest to you. I think that perhaps it is people wanting to describe themselves as heroes or feel like they're doing something for the public, but when really it seems to me that they're doing it for themselves. They're doing it to satisfy their own egos. They're doing it maybe because it's actually quite thrilling to go and chase people down. They're doing it because they can behave in ways that society wouldn't usually allow them to behave, acting covertly, investigating people, invading people's privacy, sometimes assaulting people or trapping people, keeping them false prisoner, things like that. But they're doing it under the guise of this thing where they are going after paedophiles, and everyone knows paedophiles and paedophilia, there's no nuance there. You have to be 100% down on that. You can't, it's just a very bad thing.
And they're also not just giving those details to the police, are they, Felicity? They are uploading the videos of them confronting these paedophiles to the internet. Sometimes they're live streaming them on social media. They're operating in a world of public shame, not justice.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's something that sits really uncomfortably with me, actually. It's almost such a visceral reaction to the fact that they are streaming it online to sometimes, millions of viewers. It is something about the public humiliation, and I can't really put my finger on it, but I really, really, really dislike it. And I think part of it is slightly going back to James's point of the psychology of why paedophile hunters do this in the first place. Looking into it, it's often the case that the huge majority of them have direct personal experience of child abuse themselves. So a lot of the time that sort of feels like a sort of eye for an eye type justice, which I think is very problematic. But the other thing is that, they're not always successful. They can get it wrong. It can stir up a huge emotional response, which isn't always a good thing. In terms of mob violence, there have been cases of, people going off to someone's house and setting their cars on fire, or, really taking justice into their own hands. There have been cases of suicides, and I think that's actually why Stinson Hunter stopped his paedophile hunting activities, because it was turning into this thing where the people he was tracking down were killing themselves. And there is that dreadful case from, I think it was 2013, and I'm not sure if you remember it, but a disabled man called Bijan Abrahimi in Bristol, who taking photos of children because they were attacking his hanging baskets, and he intended to hand the images to police as evidence of what these kids were doing. But someone saw him, assumed he was a paedophile, and there was a huge mob turned up outside his house chanting "pedo, pedo," and he was murdered.
I guess the flip side of that, though, John, is that in stoking the mob, if you like, at least these vigilante groups do succeed in notifying the community about a particular predator who is known, and that includes the police, and then the community at large can be watchful with regard to future crimes, even if the data they've collected on any particular indiscretion is inadmissible. And I suppose that is a kind of public service that the police can't do.
I mean, look, I've got to be honest here. I think that we tend to rush in these particular cases, and it is very much to do with child abuse, I've noticed, to have a sort of, calm down everyone kind of attitude, particularly in the media, that there's a mob just waiting there around the corner in every housing estate to go and torch something at any point. And I actually think that's extremely unfair perception. And so I think that one of the reasons that these people feel that they need to do what they're doing is because there's a question mark over how seriously we take this. I don't think it's unreasonable to kind of look at the events of the past 10 years and question how vigilant and how responsive our institutions have been to child abuse and allegations of child abuse. Jimmy Savile's a very obvious kind of high-profile example who apparently was an open secret. And I suspect that in most institutions where there's children who are potentially easy targets, you're going to find this kind of thing coming out. I think that there is a reason that people feel that this isn't always taken seriously, and that's because a lot of the time it isn't. Now, that's not to fall down the black hole of kind of conspiracy theories, but I do think that there's an issue here. Before we kind of turn around and start saying, right, we need to kind of stop these guys from doing what they're doing, we need to recognise, right, well, why is this need there?
But there is an acceleration, isn't there, in terms of public perception of people. They're labelled as paedophiles. These are people that often obviously have families and colleagues and whatever, and they've been shamed on social media, when I suppose in some cases, using inverted commas here, all they've done is groom someone and not, consummate through to any conclusion there. They were on their way to meet someone, but it didn't happen. And yet they are lumped together with serial rapists and people like Jimmy Savile. That's a problem in terms of how the justice system works, isn't it, James?
Well, I think, so in this case that's gone to the Supreme Court, Sutherland had actually been previously imprisoned in 2015 for 21 months because he sent a 12-year-old boy explicit pictures and inappropriate messages. I do think that probably, rather than necessarily always trying to go and criminalise people's kind of actions in that way, something that we've seen in other countries, like in Germany, there's a lot more emphasis being put now on trying to treat people kind of almost medically, as if it's a kind of a disorder that someone has mentally, to be interested in children in a sexual way. And I think that surely we should be trying to do everything that we can, exploring all avenues to stop children ultimately getting hurt. And while it's really difficult to actually say, maybe we need to try and treat these people as if they're ill, that might actually be an avenue that needs more exploration. And by kind of getting these vigilantes out going around paedophile hunting, it doesn't actually help anybody.
Because, Felicity, someone who has sexual feelings for children is hardly going to step forward and say, I feel like that, I need help.
Yeah.
This is the result of even acknowledging an interest.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just going back to this case, I think it's the human rights element that sits so uncomfortably with people viewing the case. It's the idea that, is this infringing on a paedophile's right to privacy, basically? Is there a conflict?
I mean, it sits uncomfortably with me, I'll be honest. I'm trying to be impartial. But it does seem a slightly outrageous thing. Someone who's been to prison for paedophilia is now appealing for his human rights. It makes your blood pressure rise, doesn't it?
I mean, but that isn't your blood pressure rising isn't the basis for how we make law. But I think, the Solicitor General for Scotland's Prosecution Service, she put it as, there is no right to respect for such behaviour in a democratic society, and I do think that is very, very powerful. It's just a really unclear area of the law. That's the other thing. The law really needs to get to grips of whether vigilantism is illegal or not, because at the moment it's just not clear whether what these guys are doing. However you feel about it, we need the law to bring some clarity to this area. So I think this is really the time that the law needs to step in and give us the clarity.
Okay, John, you're up next after this. All right, John, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week that the future of money was revealed?
The government can directly control each person's wallet and decide how you can spend your own money. For example, let's say the government paid you a salary of 3,000 yuan. If needed, it can impose a restriction on your money, making it so you can only spend 1,000 yuan on rice.
Chinese commentator Tang Jingyuan speaking on NTD News. John, what's the story?
Basically, the Chinese government has started rolling out a pilot programme for a digital version of its currency, the yuan, and it's been rolled out in 4 big cities. And this is basically, we know what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin's a digital currency. The digital version of the yuan would be a bit like kind of Bitcoin in that it's actual digital cash. It's not the same as making a payment with a credit card or with a debit card. It's almost like...
It's not an IOU.
Or it's money that actually lives on your wallet, only it's digital. So it's like cash.
And its value would be pegged, would it, to the yuan? So it's different to Bitcoin in that respect
Yes.
as well. It's not decentralised. It's the most centralised thing.
Well, this is the other core difference. It's basically the exact same as the yuan. So it's backed by the Chinese government and it's issued by the Chinese central bank. So from that point of view, whereas Bitcoin is essentially ownerless, nobody issues it. It's a distributed network that digs it out of the ether, and therefore it's completely decentralized and it exists almost by itself.
Okay, so if it's the same as the yuan, then why is this that exciting a story? I mean, I can have my Tesco vouchers in paper form, or I can have them on my Tesco app, and they mean the same thing. So what's the change, even if you apply that to a currency?
Well, this is a big deal because effectively what it means is that you would end up getting rid of cash. So the idea is that you replace, say what's happening here. You would replace the pound, as in kind of pound notes and fivers, with kind of entirely digital cash. What that then means is that every single transaction within the economy, assuming that it's central bank issued rather than Bitcoin, can be traced. So every time you pay someone anything, the government knows that you've done that instantly. And also, if the government wants to change the interest rate on your bank account, then it can do it at the flick of a switch. Essentially, you've got much more control over the money that's going around the economy and far more visibility. And while that has certain upsides, it obviously has quite a lot of potential downsides, particularly if you're going to apply it to an economy like China, which is already, of course, authoritarian. It basically means that China's got extreme visibility over transactions, and also it could potentially kind of cut people out of the financial system altogether.
Because it's being sold, James, isn't it, as something that could bring a lot more people into the financial system. You know, hundreds of millions of people in China who live with no bank account at all will now have more of a role to play in the financial system than they do at the moment.
Yeah, there are something like 225 million people in China who don't have access to a bank account at the moment, as you're saying. And they also have to have, in China, a massive use of smartphone payments. So 80% of smartphone users in China regularly pay for transactions on their devices. We're used to seeing that in London. You know, we go around tapping our phones to get on the tube and things like that. But maybe it's not as prevalent in the rest of the UK. Whereas in China, it's actually the highest rate in the whole world. So people are pretty much used to using their phones for this kind of thing in China. They're used to using digital currencies. I think, as John was saying, the real worry here is China's it's basically a move for China to get more control of its citizens, and there are worries already that payments could start to be linked to this social credit system which they have in China, where citizens with very good behaviour get extra privileges. Citizens who are deemed to not be behaving in the interests of the party and the state have fewer privileges and are often monitored, and this is a way of monitoring people.
That may be the fear for the West. You know, look at this totalitarian regime and how they're imposing more controls on their people. But actually for the Chinese, you know, as James says, WeChat is already a hugely popular way to pay in China. So is Alipay. It's effectively like paying through WhatsApp. And Chinese people who like the government might feel that they'd prefer to have the state administering that system than a private company.
I think so. I think it's worth saying, firstly, that it is very early days for the risk. It feels like there's a lot of hype but little to show for it just yet. And also, just to reiterate that point that you make, that cash transactions are extremely rare in China. So in terms of a mental leap, this doesn't feel like a huge deal, I think, for a lot of Chinese people. I mean, my friend lives out in China. He works for Reuters news agency there, and it's just astonishing the types of things that he'll buy using a QR code. He was once going for a run, and he came across just a sort of big pile of water bottles, and someone had just left the QR code, and that was just how you paid. And he's also noticed 24-hour unmanned sex shops where all you need is to scan your code, and that's how you pay. So it's totally different system, I think, out there. I think even in quite rural areas, you know, cash isn't the default way to pay. I think from a Western perspective, I suppose the other thing that needs mentioning is the idea of how it will affect the US and the US's dominance when it comes to sanctions and payments in that kind of thing, and whether this would, once it is up and running, whether this would undermine the efficacy of US sanctions. So, for example, if sanctions are placed on Iran, whether they can, subvert institutions that rely on US dollars and instead turn to Chinese digital currency. So I think it could potentially have huge implications for the US. And again, if the US intelligence community couldn't rely on financial transaction data to see, for example, if Iran was purchasing nuclear materials. So it does feel like there's that international digital arms race maybe of what this could mean for the US and for other countries and for sanctions.
Yeah, because presumably, John, one of the mission statements of the Chinese is to try and get the yuan to be the international currency that things are paid for in, like the dollar is for oil.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really good point. The tricky thing is, actually, to be fair, one of the impetuses for China to develop a digital currency is obviously the kind of dominance of the dollar. So the dollar's the currency that's used in most international transactions, basically, and that means it's the reserve currency. And in some ways, that's got its downsides for the US, but the upsides far outweigh it. What's happened under both, to be fair, the Obama administration, but it's accelerated under the Trump administration, is America's willingness to use the dollar as an economic weapon. So, for example, being able to cut a lot of kind of individual Russians, never mind the whole country, out from the dollar payments system. And therefore that basically means that you struggle very much to move money around the world and to buy a lot of things because you're cut off from the dollar. And so this is making it almost more urgent for countries like China, who are very aware, who's the main challenger to the US in terms of global power, and is very aware that the yuan as it is an extremely minor currency in global terms. It's kind of crept into the kind of central bank reserves. So central banks hold a little bit of yuan, but they hold far more even sterling, Aussie dollar, euros, and dollars than the yuan. So it's not really a reserve currency yet. So the goal here would be to, if you like, kind of opt out of the dollar system and, as you're both saying, one day, ideally replace it, or certainly kind of stand alongside it as an alternative global reserve currency. Will that happen? The thing is, that is a long way away. It takes a very long time to supplant kind of a currency. The last time it happened, it was the pound making way for the dollar after the Second World War. But that process kind of happened even probably after the First World War. But it still took the best part of a good few decades to pan out.
And looking those few decades ahead, James, here in Britain, do you think we could end up adopting a similar system, however bizarre it might seem to us at the moment? Because we've seen during the coronavirus crisis, haven't we, an acceleration of the push away from cash towards contactless payment for hygiene reasons. We're all being encouraged to download this NHS app, or we will be soon, which some people were concerned about from a civil liberties point of view, and people seem happy to give the government that data in certain circumstances. It's not impossible to imagine, is it, that within a few years Britons might be more accepting of a government-controlled payment system?
Yeah, I think that we could very well end up with a kind of cashless society where we're seeing kind of our money stored digitally. That's already, as you say, what's happening all over the place. I'm not sure I would be entirely comfortable with it, because I think that having the option to pay in cash is a good thing, and I think having that remaining available to people will always be necessary, as you were talking about, in terms of civil liberties and privacy and things like that. But I do think that for me, when I buy things, I don't really mind paying with my card or with my phone or something. It's just a lot easier. And if that was more ubiquitous, if everywhere I went I could pay with my phone, that would actually make my life a lot easier. So it's another thing where we're kind of having to weigh up the pros of things like convenience and the cons of things like losing a bit of privacy.
It also alienates perhaps an older generation, doesn't it, Felicity?
Yeah, and who are much more wedded to the idea of keeping cash on them. I think the other things say that in a pandemic, people are much more happy to kind of relinquish their civil liberties and their freedoms, and without really questioning too much where the data is going or what the implications of this. And you're seeing this even this week from a political point of view, and sort of new laws being rushed through about coronavirus without any parliamentary scrutiny or sort of debate about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So I think it's important to sort of note that this is taking place against the backdrop of a pandemic, and this is when ordinary people are far more likely to be like, yeah, sure, go for it. And you just have to think very, very carefully about the implications of that.
And I'm curious, John, how much cash do you normally carry around in your wallet, and has that changed over the years? Because for me, personally, once I got to the stage where I could afford to do this, I always used to withdraw £100 at a time. I'd always feel safe with £100 in my wallet. And for whatever reason, increased contactless payments, more of a cashless society, I'm now fairly secure walking around with £15.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm really scatty. And I would often walk out with no money at all and just assume that I could kind of tap for just about everything. So I'm completely on board with the idea of the convenience. It's just I always like to have the option. I learned the hard lesson, basically, that I should try and have, about £100 in my wallet all the time because I'm terrible at remembering to get it.
This was actually a lesson that we were taught in Boy Scouts, that you always had to have a 20p piece in your bum bag. And then I was actually thrown out because I went to the chip shop and bought a chip butty with my 20p, and then was told that I wasn't welcome back at Scouts. So there are lessons to be learned here.
So many conflicting images about our perception of you there, James. Boy Scouts on the one hand, chip butty on the other. It's your story next after this. OK, James, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why the NHS is suffering a depression pandemic.
Thursday, 25th of June 2009. Down in A&E around 11 p.m. to review a patient and thumbing through Twitter while I work up the strength to see her. There's a big news story breaking, but so far only gossip merchants TMZ have reported it. Oh, Christ, I gasp. Michael Jackson's dead. One of the nurses sighs and stands up. Which cubicle?
Adam Kay, reading from his best-selling book, This Is Going to Hurt, Secret Diaries of a Junior Doctor. Now, James, the struggles of doctors are very much in the news. You're supposed to be bringing us underreported stories, so what am I missing?
Well, I think that the struggles of doctors are in the news, but often what we're seeing is people clapping for them, calling them heroes, and basically forgetting that behind those scrubs are real people with real challenges. And just like most people at the moment, doctors are feeling heightened levels of anxiety, depression, stress and burnout. So a new survey of UK doctors from the British Medical Association has found that there's a major burnout factor going on at the moment. 41% of doctors are feeling some degree of emotional distress or a mental health condition. And a lot of them are saying it's been actually made worse by the pandemic. 29% have said that COVID and having to deal with all of that has made things worse for their own mental health. And the BMA alone, its own wellbeing support services, have had a 40% increase in their use over the last 3 months. So doctors are clearly suffering at the moment.
And I suppose the point is, Felicity, you could say the same about the army, couldn't you? You know, people go out to war zones, they come back with trauma and stress, but they sort of signed up for that knowingly. Whereas with doctors, perhaps they've never seen anything like this in their careers and couldn't have anticipated it.
Yeah, completely. I spoke to an ICU nurse at the beginning of the pandemics. She was working at a hospital near where I live, and I wanted to sort of get a sense of what it was like on her ward. And I think she was saying that she was going to have mental health problems for the rest of her life, and she had colleagues who she, seriously thought were going to have PTSD issues for a very long, long time. But part of the thing that really moved me about what she said was that part of the thing she loved about her job was the very small acts of care that she could give to patients and to COVID patients. And it was things like being able to brush someone's hair or wash their teeth, or just very small acts of care. And she said that the pressures on them meant that she could no longer do these things. It was very kind of like, make sure you're basically still alive, move on to the next person, move on to the next person. They were completely overwhelmed. And I thought that in relation to this story was really, really significant, because I think for so many of these professionals, it is the idea that you are saving lives and you're caring and you're there to help. And when the system is underfunded or completely overwhelmed by a pandemic or whatever it may be, you can't fulfill the functions of your job in the way that you want to and in the way that gives you a sense of kind of purpose and meaning. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, there's a political dimension to this, isn't there, James? Because, for example, one of the anxieties keeping medics awake at night has been the lack of PPE.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, clearly the health services response has been hampered by the lack of PPE and the lack of funding, as Felicity was saying. But it's not just COVID. I mean, in January, there was a survey published in the British Medical Journal, which then said that 31% of doctors were suffering from burnout, stress and compassion fatigue. So if you've already got a third of people pre-coronavirus landing in the NHS saying that they're feeling, basically knackered, then having a pandemic following that, which has been one of the worst things that most doctors will have had to deal with professionally in their lives coming along, is going to completely exhaust them. And, a BMA study from 2019 found that 8 in 10 doctors were at significant risk of burnout, and over a quarter of those had previously been diagnosed with a mental health condition.
Burnout, though, it's a bit of a slippery diagnosis, isn't it? Particularly for the medical industry. We understand if there is a diagnosed psychiatric illness, there are certain accompanying rights in the workplace, reasonable adjustments, time off if needs be. But is burnout covered by that? It's quite a generic term. I mean, Felicity, what else would you like to see happen in response to these kinds of statistics?
I think even just looking at this pandemic and realising how much we rely on the NHS and how many of the people who work in it will have implications to their mental health for a long, long time to come. I think even acknowledging that is a start. I think things like the fact that it is understaffed. I know there are things in place for NHS workers who are suffering from mental health, but I'm just not convinced at the moment that's adequate. It just certainly doesn't feel like it is. I think it's also maybe, if you're understaffed and you're having to do the work of 2 or 3 other colleagues, if you're not sleeping, if you're worried about, especially with this virus, about taking it home to your families, if you're BAME, you have such a far higher risk of contracting it. There are so many smaller things that I think just even acknowledge. I mean, I wasn't aware that the suicide rate of doctors in the US is really, really high, actually. And James is right that this was an existing problem before the pandemic came along, but I think this is the new normal. The new reality is that this pandemic will have just completely chucked a bomb into mental health provision all over the world, and it's something that I think we feel like we're just going to have to start from scratch in how we think about it and acknowledge it and respect these institutions that basically keep the country going at times like these.
And I have to say, I think there is a touch of the Dulce Decorum Est about it, because it's like the same way that we see soldiers dying in war and we say, isn't that a noble sacrifice? And we're out there clapping for our NHS workers and saying, aren't they heroes? Well, what they're doing might be heroic, but they're just people, and they're going to work and they have families and lives, and they're interested, presumably, in staying alive. They don't want to become the latest sacrifice. They don't want to become a statistic on healthcare workers that have died fighting COVID-19. They want to go home safely to their families. So I think we have to say that is genuinely stressful. They probably are genuinely frightened, and they probably wish that this would all go away, not just because it's stressful, but because they're worried about their own safety.
If we might try and end on a positive note this week, I suppose, Felicity, the one recurring theme of medics being interviewed in the media over the last 3 months is the thought comes up, whether it's the person interviewing them or the interviewee, the thought comes up that once this is all over, however you define that, whenever this is, there's going to be a recognition of the role that medics play in society and their importance to us. There's going to be a reprioritisation of that.
Well, I feel like you're asking for a positive comment, and I will end with something positive. But to begin with, I think maybe there is something slightly idealistic and naive in that. I remember when Johnson came out of hospital and he gave that speech thanking Jenny from New Zealand and Luis from Portugal, and I wondered whether he had been slightly chastened by his experience and he was going to think about the NHS and funding for it in a completely different way. And then subsequently with the whole debate over the surcharge, I thought maybe not so fast. But having said that, what does give me hope, and I think, is actually my readers, and I think the Week Juniors audience. I do slightly think that they are living through something that none of us have lived through. This will be such a formative, huge experience for them. Not going to school, making the rainbows that they're sticking in their windows, and I wonder whether we will see a new generation grow up with a completely newfound respect, admiration, appreciation for the NHS. Maybe we'll see more of them who actually want to be nurses and doctors, and will think about the NHS in a more imaginative way of how we can make it better.
There we go. I knew you could rise to the challenge. I was mentally playing Land of Hope and Glory under the whole speech. Well, Dr. Mann is signing off shift. That is it for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to John, Felicity and James. May I prescribe to you our entire back catalogue. It will never burn out. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.